Hey guys, it's me again. Hope you watched that little 8-minute blurb on Cosmos. Cosmos is that guy, Carl Sagan, says the word humans in a different way. This chapter is primarily interested in how life originated on planet Earth. There's a lot of different hypotheses, but the study of astrobiology is when you try to figure out the origin, evolution, distribution, and destiny of life in the universe. And Carl Sagan was really fascinated in this. It's basically trying to answer three really hard questions to answer. One, how does life begin and develop? Two, does life exist elsewhere in the universe? And three, what is life's future on Earth and beyond? And this might sort of bring you back to freshman year or in the beginning of the year when you learned about astronomy. But because of all of the advances that we've had in the biological sciences and in space exploration and astronomy and our ability to view the universe, it does make it possible for us to start to realistically answer these questions. But again, a lot of this is big, taking some big questions and trying to answer them with not all that much information. So here's what we know. We know that free oxygen probably wasn't present in the early atmosphere when the Earth first formed. Remember, that was like 4.6 billion years ago. A lot of the compounds that they found in early rocks don't have oxygen, and significant amounts of oxygen really didn't show up until the process of photosynthesis was well underway, which was not until a couple billion years ago. Some of the ideas about the origin of life really can't be stated in the form of a hypothesis because it can't really be tested with the conditions we have right now. So we're kind of limited in our ability to investigate those ideas. Mineral crystals have been proposed as an early sort of information molecule with a repeating structure, much like many of the polymers that we find in living organisms. And it's generally agreed that RNA is more likely a candidate for life formation than DNA because DNA is the double helix. It's a little more complex than RNA, and it requires proteins for replication, whereas RNA can sort of begin its own splicing or breaking apart. So this is just an image of what the early atmosphere might have looked like, and there's those crystals that may have been the building blocks for life, and that's just showing you a sort of conceptual model of how RNA could self-replicate without the proteins necessary. So the conditions on Earth were probably pretty similar, on early Earth were probably pretty similar to those on Venus or Mars today. That would be pretty high levels of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and nitrogen gas, and small amounts of hydrogen gas. It's easier to understand how organic compounds formed, the compounds necessary for life were formed, than it is to try to understand how the first cells were formed. Chemical evolution, the idea of chemicals forming, monomers forming polymers, and then making their way into more complex systems like cells. They think that they may have originated those chemicals from primitive seas. Darwinian evolution gives us a way by which organisms can change over time, but that couldn't really start until you had chemical evolution, which resulted in the first single-celled organism. And then there's the question of energy source. So where we know that all organisms need energy, but we're just not sure what they used. Early energy sources could have been lightning, UV radiation, or heat from radioactive decay within the Earth. And these energy sources could have driven chemical reactions that produced the first life. And then those organisms that were most efficient at using that energy had an advantage over the less efficient organisms. So there's just some pictures of Venus and Mars, and the idea of inorganic molecules like methane, water, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen coming together to become organic monomers, which that came together to become organic polymers, which then formed life. But did those organic monomers come from space, or did they come from Earth itself? So here's a little cartoon for you. It says, today's recipe for what I call the origin of life requires a bit of hydrogen, nitrogen, compounds of sulfur, carbon, and a smattering of metals, iron, magnesium. The heterotrophs hypothesis was proposed a while ago, and it was basically a hypothesis for how heterotrophs, or other eaters, came about. So these are organisms that get their food from the environment. And it came about in the 1920s, and these two guys, Oparin and Haldane, both came up with this theory on their own. And what they decided was that the early atmosphere probably had the following gases and chemicals in it: methane, ammonia, hydrogen, water vapor, and some sort of energy source, radioactivity, lightning, cosmic radiation, volcanic heat, reacted with those gases, and boom, sort of like a witch's cauldron, organic compounds arose. In order for this to work out, they basically had three requirements. One was that some sort of non-biological process had to supply some of the organic molecules. And then some process had to trigger those little small molecules to form into polymers, like nucleic acids or proteins. And then some other process had to organize the polymers so they could replicate themselves. So as long as you had a way to make these organic molecules, get them to assemble themselves and replicate, then that could explain how life evolved. Now keep in mind, this was a great idea, but they had no real mechanism for how this could have happened. So in 1952, these two guys, Urey and Miller, wanted to run an experiment, and this is sort of a classic experiment that everybody sees in their textbooks, where they wanted to mimic the conditions of primeval Earth and see if they could get life to evolve. So they basically took all the gases that were in the early atmosphere, water, methane, hydrogen gas, etc., and they put it in a closed system, and they heated it up, and they sparked it with an electrode. And they did this for a while, and after a while they found this black gunk that had sort of developed on the inside of here. And they tested that gunk, and they found that it was made up of amino acids, and therefore they agreed that the early atmosphere could have produced the building blocks, or chemical building blocks, for organic molecules. And they said, obviously there weren't electrodes sparking, but there was lightning storms and whatnot, so maybe that's how life originated. There's been a lot of skepticism concerning Miller's experiment. While amino acids and other organic compounds may very well have been formed in here, they wouldn't have formed in the amounts which this experiment produced, and that's what they say. And another objection is that the experiment required a tremendous amount of energy that may or may not have been available. So while it's believed that lightning storms were pretty common, they were not continuous as the Miller and Urey experiment portrayed. So there is a clip I'd love you to watch after you finish this screencast that shows Carl Sagan explaining this experiment. So early organisms, we know they lived in an atmosphere that didn't have oxygen, so they could not use aerobic respiration. So they had to be anaerobes, and they probably were methogens, which means they used methane gas to get their energy. There is some evidence of photoautotrophs dating back 4 billion years. Remember, photo means sunlight, and autotroph means making your own energy. Oxygen gas was probably pretty insignificant in our atmosphere until about 2 billion years ago, so that means aerobic respiration wasn't possible until 2 billion years ago. And remember, anaerobic respiration is pretty inefficient, and it's hard to be more than a single-celled organism if you don't have the ability to make large amounts of ATP. So the endosymbiotic hypothesis is this idea of how these eukaryotic organisms finally arose. And if you remember from last year, symbiotic is a mutualistic relationship where two organisms end up depending on each other. And the idea is that the first microfossils of eukaryotic cells date back to about 1.4 billion years ago. And in this hypothesis, they basically proposed that a eukaryotic cell originated by one bigger anaerobic prokaryotic cell sort of ingesting a smaller aerobic prokaryotic cell, and it lived within it and became what we know as the mitochondria or the chloroplast, and that allowed it to have organelles that we see today. So here's a little animation of that.
The eukaryotic internal membrane system, called the endoplasmic reticulum, and the nuclear envelope may have evolved from infoldings of the plasma membrane in an ancestral prokaryotic cell. Such infoldings are common in modern prokaryotic cells. The theory of endosymbiosis proposes that a critical stage in the evolution of eukaryotic cells involved endosymbiotic relationships with prokaryotic organisms. Microorganisms that live within other cells and perform specific functions for their host cells are called endosymbionts. According to the theory, energy-producing bacteria may have been engulfed by a larger primitive cell and come to reside within it, eventually evolving into what we now know as mitochondria. Photosynthetic bacteria use photosynthetic pigments embedded in internal membranes to derive energy from sunlight. These bacteria may have come to live within early eukaryotic cells, leading to the evolution of chloroplasts. Several facts provide evidence for the endosymbiotic hypothesis. A few examples include: 1. Mitochondria and chloroplasts contain their own circular DNA, similar to DNA in bacteria. 2. Both mitochondria and chloroplasts are surrounded by two membranes. The inner membrane is probably evolved from the plasma membrane of the engulfed prokaryote, while the outer membrane is probably derived from the cell membrane of the host. 3. Mitochondria are about the same size as bacteria. 4. Mitochondria appear to have been derived from purple bacteria, and chloroplasts derived from photosynthetic bacteria.
So you can see that once we figured out that the prokaryotic cells could live within another prokaryotic cell and become the organelles, then life could evolve into multicellular organisms. The bottom line is that the question of whether life was created by some supernatural being really can't be investigated by the methods of science that we have, because there's really no controlled experiment to set that up and run it. But we can make a lot of hypotheses and educated guesses about how life got here, and then we can try to imagine if there's life on other planets. Have a great vacation. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.